Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 186. This week our questions are taken from guide 236 on HMS Sovereign of the Seas and the accompanying Wednesday video on hull form design. So let's get into it. Matthew Kelly asks, did any other ship have a name as pretentious or more pretentious than Sovereign of the Seas? Oh, there were plenty. People really liked naming ships with some rather pretentious ideals. I mean, there's a whole string of Royal Navy vessels called HMS Invincible, for one thing. Didn't work out quite so well for the one in the First World War, but other nations also really got stuck in on the act. I mean, this particular painting shows the Spanish ship Salvador del Mundo, which, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, is Saviour of the World, being raked by HMS Victory shortly before its capture. Turns out it couldn't even be Salvador de si mismo. And that's before you get into somewhat ironic names like Indivisible, Indivisible, which ends up being captured and broken up, so not quite so indivisible after all. So, yeah, there's plenty of presumptuous names and names full of hubris amongst all sorts of navies, pretty much Age of Sail, pre-Age of Sail, post-Age of Sail as well. Still are, for that matter, in a lot of navies. Miguel Ayuban asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a ship placed on a cement platform like the Mikasa? And if there was a ship that could have the same treatment, which one would you like it to be? The funny thing is there's not actually that many advantages to putting a ship in cement. Pretty much the only big one is the cement forms an all-around support for the ship's hull, which, as they found with HMS Victory, if you put a ship on relatively few frames in a dry dock for a prolonged period of time, the ship's hull tends to deform around those supports. Now, you can solve that by having considerably more supports added to a ship in dry dock, which also allows you to air out the hull, access the hull from different angles, and so on and so forth. But, you know, if you absolutely have to, well, sticking it in concrete means it effectively simulates the same kind of support you'd get if the ship was at sea. So that's an advantage. The other advantage, I guess, is the ship's very unlikely to move anywhere. Mikasa was put in concrete largely because of stipulations in the naval treaties in the interwar period. But there are a raft of problems with putting a ship in concrete. One of which is now the ship is completely bound to the land, so in the event that you do have something like an earthquake, it's probably more likely to be affected by that than if you had the ship on enough supports. Also, if you do need to move the ship for whatever reason to repair or relocate it, good luck if you've set it in concrete. And perhaps far more relevantly, at least for iron and steel ships, and to an extent for wooden ships as well, concrete is acidic. It will gradually eat into the ship. It's one of the reasons why rebar concrete has a finite lifespan, even if the rebar is completely and fully enclosed. I mean, as an engineer, it's one of my bugbears, rebar concrete, because if you get any kind of water intrusion in it at all and the rebar rusts, then everything starts to fall apart. And even if you don't get water intrusion, if you use a waterproof concrete mix or something like that, the concrete itself will gradually eat away and oxidize the rebar. So all those wonderful buildings you see built with concrete rebar that you think, oh yeah, well, 200, 300, 400 years from now, maybe 1,000 years from now, after some kind of apocalyptic event, some of our big skyscrapers will be there alongside the Great Pyramids. No, they won't. Rebar concrete buildings have a lifespan of about 100 to 150 years, after which they will basically collapse. And so, yeah, if all of humanity disappeared tomorrow, then the pyramids would still be there 1,000 years from now. I can guarantee you the vast majority of modern cities wouldn't be, although from an aesthetic perspective that's probably for the best. Your brick-built house is probably more likely to be around in 300-400 years than a concrete rebar-built skyscraper is. And minor diversion into concrete mechanics aside, it is a fundamental issue that if you put a ship in cement concrete, it's going to eventually, without some kind of significant protective barrier, eat the ship. Now, that may not be too much of a problem, depending on, I mean, obviously if you don't want the ship to move at all, if the ship's got enough material to be in its hull to be sacrificial, or you use a particularly inert concrete mix, but inevitably that's going to happen. So you're either going to have to be maintaining the hull from the inside, or eventually end up with basically from the waterline up on display, and underneath is going to be the main structural supports holding up an interesting collection of rust. So overall, I really wouldn't want another ship to be put in concrete unless there is no other alternative. I know in my first video on USS Texas I suggested that might be an option, but I would say it's really only an option if the alternative is the ship is going to fall apart because of the aforementioned support capabilities, or if you can put the ship in cement, get the support from the cement, but have some kind of intervening barrier between the cement and the ship. So, I mean, not that you'd use the actual material, but in principle, if you were to wrap the ship in multiple layers of something like cling film or pond liner, some kind of protective barrier that is close to the skin of the ship, and then set all of that in cement, as long as the liner itself isn't going to be eaten away by the concrete over time, then you'd get all the supportive elements of having the ship in concrete without having the hull eaten away. So in those cases, then in extremis cases, it might worth be doing in order to save the ship. The other advantage, of course, is that if you do have some kind of protective separate layer, if you ever do need to excavate the ship, it's still going to be an absolute pig because you're going to have thousands of tons of concrete to remove, but at least it won't be bonded to the ship itself. Tommy Blackwell asks, I've been reading about unrated US Navy vessels of the early 19th century, schooners, ketchers, etc., many of which were apparently armed with a few carronades and broadside with one or two long guns on pivot mounts. Whilst I'm familiar with carronade mounts, I haven't been able to find drawings or descriptions of the pivot mounts for long guns. How were they constructed? How was the piece traversed? And was there a practical limitation to the size of the gun that could be carried, aside from vessel or size and displacement? And perhaps most important, how was recoil managed, with a corollary question as to practical arcs of fire? And why didn't they see use aboard rated vessels until the development of large caliber rifles and shell guns in the mid-century? Well, in this view of HMS Victory, you can see the pivot mountings for the 268-pound carronades, and the pivot mountings for long guns, at least on small vessels, weren't all that much different. So this effectively consists of a large wooden board with a pair of horizontally mounted wheels at the back which allow for the pivoting, which is then fixed to a block of wood which is fixed to the deck at the front, and that has the spindle or whatever you want to call it that allows the board to pivot as a whole. So that's the thing that actually pivots, and then on top of that you have a smaller board onto which a small carriage for the gun is built, and that's a friction slide. So the recoil is mostly dealt with by just friction, wood on wood sliding, and if you want to align the gun, you haul on ropes that are attached to either side, and the gun pivots round to fire. In terms of practical limitations to this kind of pivot mounting, the main thing is that with the long guns, and the heavier ones in specific, so 24-pounder, 32-pounder, that kind of thing, then it becomes impractical because, one, the wooden slide won't necessarily take all the friction and it might still break itself off the mounting, and secondly, a long 24 or 32-pounder gun weighs an awful lot. Part of the advantage of the small four-wheeled carriage for most naval guns is that, relatively speaking, given that it's still a several-ton weapon, with the help of some ropes and pulleys, you can haul the gun back into firing position. With the friction slide, you have to put in a lot more effort to get the thing to shift because you're overcoming the friction of surface-on-surface contact instead of, just wheels. And so there's limits to how heavy a gun you can have on this slide before it becomes too heavy to maneuver. Or, as I said, for heavier, longer guns, the recoil might become too much for the slide anyway. The reason why you'd have it in the first place is basically either because you can get away with it because the gun is, relatively speaking, lightweight, which is carronades are, or if you don't have a lot of space in the ship, on a smaller ship, to accommodate the longer recoil of a wheeled gun carriage, and or it's, you know, not too much of a fuss if you only have to shift the gun a little bit further forward, which again comes into small guns and small ships. As for why slide carriages and pivot mounts weren't used in larger ships for their main batteries until you get into much bigger rifled guns and shell guns, etc., it's mostly to do with the fact that once you get past a certain size and certain amount of recoil of gun, then the wheeled carriage actually starts to be a bit too easily moving, i.e. if you're using a 110 pounder or a 9 or 10 inch gun or something like that, the amount of recoil that's present is so great that the relatively small amount that's lost on with a wheeled gun carriage going backwards isn't enough to lessen the strain on the ropes and pulleys that are mounted to the ship, so you will end up either snapping the ropes or ripping the mounting points out of the ship or out of the gun carriage, so you need some way of absorbing more of that gun's energy. And on top of that, you also have the fact that by the time you're talking about these kinds of guns, i.e. 1860s onwards, roughly speaking, for the most part, there are other mechanical aids available. So metal on metal plating, or metal on wood, or some form of lubrication, upward sloping ramping, or recoil absorption mechanisms that aren't just ropes, so springs and such like. So there's a lot more mechanical aids that make pivot and slide mountings much more practical for larger guns once you get into the latter part of the 19th century. And then, of course, that moves on to hydraulic shock-absorbing mountings and so forth once you get into the pre-dreadnought age and thereafter. Brendan Buersdorf asks, what was the effectiveness of machine guns as anti-aircraft weapons in both world wars? I've noticed a lot of ships were fitted with such guns, such as twin Hotchkiss 1914 mounts for the French, quad Maxim 1910 guns for the Russian, quad 12.7mm Vickers for the British, and quad 13.2mm machine guns on Japanese ships. Could they be effective earlier on in their respective conflicts, or were they useless from the get-go? So what it comes down to is aircraft durability and weapons release range. So if an aircraft is, I don't know, a fabric, mostly fabric and wood biplane, then a machine gun is, especially if it's a heavy machine gun with tracer rounds or something like that, is likely to be pretty effective. It's going to be less effective against an all-metal fast monoplane, such as, you know, would often be found in the Second World War. The other factor, as I said, is the deployment range of the weapon that the aircraft's using versus the effective range of the machine gun. Now, obviously, you do have to be very careful because the absolute maximum range of a machine gun is much, much greater than its effective range when it comes to anti-aircraft defense. So, yes, your Browning 50 cal or your Vickers, as you can see here, might be able to reach out for 2 kilometers. The chances of you actually hitting something like a fast-moving aircraft at that range are basically none. So the aircraft has to be a lot closer for you to have a reasonable chance of hitting it, unless it's doing something extremely stupid, like flying low and slow straight into an oncoming stream of tracer fire that you've been keeping going for the last several seconds. But regardless, the point is a dive bomber obviously has a minimum release altitude, and a torpedo bomber, it's where it's going to drop the torpedo is going to vary partly on where it thinks it can drop to get a good hit on your ship. So if your ship is stationary or moving slowly in a straight line, a torpedo bomb is going to be a lot more confident dropping further out, whereas if you're in a high-speed vessel that's manoeuvring quite a lot, then torpedo bombs probably will want to get a bit closer to you to try and guarantee the hit. but it's also regulated by how far they can physically drop the torpedo. Early torpedoes, obviously shorter range, later torpedoes longer range, and later still torpedoes, once you've got things like the Americans putting fins on, aerodynamic fins on the Mark 13, you can drop them from even further away than you can just based on the actual motoring range of the torpedo. And what you'll find is that in World War I, anti-aircraft machine guns have a limited degree of use because the aircraft are not particularly fast, they're not particularly durable, and they have to come relatively close to drop their weapons, so within the lethal range of a machine gun. The problem is, as time goes on, the aircraft can drop from further and further away, and yeah, maybe for a dive bomber, they drop their bomb, then they have to pull up. A torpedo bomber drops its torpedo, it then has to turn around, so the aircraft might enter your machine gun range, but after it's deployed its weapon, which makes it less of a prevent attack on the ship weapon and more of a, well, we're taking this aircraft down with us, maybe, weapon, which isn't quite as useful. And, as I said, they become less effective on those kind of aircraft anyway, and then you get to a point where, certainly by the mid to latter part of the Second World War, aircraft are perfectly capable of dropping their weapons and recovering out of whatever dive or attack run they're on, without ever entering the effective range of your machine guns. And so I'd say for pretty much the entirety of World War II, sure, if somebody is dumb enough to get close enough, then some machine guns will do some damage to it. But a competently flown strike of whether it be Japanese, German, Italian, American or British aircraft, most of the time isn't actually ever going to enter the effective range of your machine guns, at which point they are largely useless, even if they have a morale effect. As you can see, this one is actually a World War II deployed, and relatively late in World War II deployed weapon. It's better than nothing, especially if your enemy aircraft thinks that you don't have any weaponry, so might get closer just for the sake of an easier kill. Then that can hurt, and it's the same kind of problem that actually afflicts the 20mm Oerlikon and the 40mm Bofors. So at the start of the war, the 20mm Oerlikon is pretty much capable of dealing out death and destruction to any aircraft that comes in range. But even by the mid part of the war, the machine gun is completely off the table in all practical senses of the word. But the Oerlikon by late 42, early 43 is beginning to struggle. It's beginning to enter the range of weapons that can destroy an aircraft after it's released its weapon, or kamikazes that are coming in regardless. But it can't stop the attack happening in the first place, and that's now the job of the 40mm Bofors and the heavy AA. And then by the late part of the war, even the 40mm Bofors is struggling, and that's why that's basically why when you see late warships and immediate post-war ships like Vanguard, they don't have any 20mm Oerlikons. They're now just purely 40mm Bofors and heavy AA, and the next step beyond that is 3-inch anti-aircraft fire or similar caliber to that, replacing the Bofors, which is what you see on something like HMS Tiger. Unemployed History Major asks, if the Dutch viewed Sovereign of the Seas as such a menace and failed so many times to sink her at a great loss to their own navy, why not just try to ram her? Surely the loss of one additional vessel would have justified the loss of such a valuable British asset. Well, they did try. They actually issued special instructions, as I've mentioned before, that for fire ship captains, for example, that if you managed to destroy this particular vessel, there was a huge additional reward put into it. But fundamentally, the Dutch had, two issues. One, even for ocean-going navies like the Royal Navy, the Sovereign of the Seas was just very big, and very strong. So ramming it with a smaller ship, even if it was another ocean-going ship, probably wasn't going to do a tremendous amount of damage, coupled with the fact that the Dutch, obviously because of the shallow nature of the waters around their ports, had to build relatively light and relatively shallow draft ships compared to everybody else. So let's say a 50-gun ship, if we take that as an example, a 50-gun British or French or Spanish built ship if it ran Sovereign of the Seas, probably isn't going to do a huge amount of damage, and a 50-gun Dutch ship is going to do even less because it's going to be lighter built, thus it's going to have less inertia, less momentum, less kinetic energy, etc. Plus, Sovereign of the Seas is a really big ship with a lot of firepower. It's going to be having some rather strong objections to somebody trying to come in and ram it anyway, so it's going to be firing back with a lot of guns, doing a lot of damage to the crew and the ship that's coming in, and dismasting it, ripping up sails, killing people who are trying to captain and steer it, which kind of slows down and renders ramming attempts somewhat ineffectual. And even beyond that, I mean, even roughly peer-on-peer ship ramming attempts in the Age of Sail usually don't result in one side or the other sinking purely because of the ram. The collisions, even if everyone really, really wants the ram, tend to take place at somewhat, speaking, pedestrian speeds. And getting a perpendicular ram, which is the best way of dealing damage to the enemy, is very difficult with an Age of Sail capital ship. So a trireme under full row against another similar vessel, they're relatively lightly built, they're relatively swift, they've got dedicated ram bows, and even then it's quite difficult to get a successful kill. And take away most of those factors when you have an Age of Sail ship of the line ramming attempt, ramming did happen, but it wasn't usually, almost never for damaging purposes. It was to initiate a boarding action. And to be fair to them, the Dutch did manage to board Sovereign of the Seas multiple times. They managed to mob it in a number of battles. It just came back again to the fact it was a very big ship with a lot of crew and a lot of guns. So it kind of, when that happened, you ended up fighting what was effectively a very close-range escalade siege action, and Sovereign of the Seas proved to be fairly adept at handling itself in those situations, at least until other ships could come and pick off all the annoying smaller Dutch ships that had clustered around it. Spectre169 asks, what was the budget for the Royal Navy throughout World War I, and how does it compare to World War II or the modern-day naval budget? So obviously the wartime budgets are considerably higher than peacetime budgets, and you do have to adjust for inflation, which is a little bit of a pig because there are multiple ways of doing that. But regardless, World War I, the 1914 naval budget was just over £103 million as compared to just under £49 million in 1913, so just over double. It then practically doubles again to just under £206 million in 1915. It stays about that level, fraction under 210 million in 1916, goes up to just over 227 million in 1917, and caps out at 334 million pounds in 1918, then drops back down to 156.5 billion in 1919, and then it tails off rather rapidly into the 1920s. Now, whilst I couldn't find precise figures for exactly how much the Royal Navy spent year on year in World War II, not immediately to hand, I could find a price index for naval expenditure. So it uses 1913 as a baseline, and then you see that the peak budget, so 1918, 1919 in World War I, is 230 to 254% of 1913. Adjusting for inflation, and then for the war period for the UK, 1939 is 126%, 1940 168%, 1941 188%, 1942 196%, 43 is 201%, 44 is 205%, and 45 is 209%. So you're looking at approximately, for the bulk of World War II, the Royal Navy's expenditure as a proportion of overall spending compared to peacetime is about a similar level to what they were spending in 1917, when they were spending quite a lot of money. So to give you some idea, in actual millions unadjusted for inflation, 1970s 227 million, just over, against a budget in peacetime of 48 million. Now, to give you some idea of proportionality, therefore, the UK GDP in, let's say, 1917, because that's the, well, it's not the highest, but it's one of the highest points in World War One, and it apparently cross-correlates proportionally to roughly what the Royal Navy was spending per year for most of World War Two. That amounts to about 5.5% of GDP. Now, if you translate that against the UK's average GDP for sort of 2018 through 2020 is about £2 trillion, that would translate to a Navy budget alone of just over £100 billion, as compared to the roughly £45 billion that constitutes the entire entire British defence budget for that time period on a yearly basis, of which the Navy gets about 15 billion, I think, roughly speaking. So, proportionally speaking, the Royal Navy budget in the last few years has been about 1/14 that of what you'd expect them to be spending on the Royal Navy in World War One or World War Two. But that's not exactly, as I say, surprising due to the fact that, that's a full-on world war. But with that said, if you translate the pre-war budgets to modern periods, then you're still looking at an equivalent naval budget if you were translating it directly from, say, the late 1900s, early 1910s, or the mid-1930s, to about £28 billion. So you'd be pretty much doubling the Royal Navy's budget as compared to what it is currently if you were going to do proportion. Stephen Rickstrew asks, the Royal Navy had more operational experience in the horrid conditions of the North Sea and above the Arctic Circle than other navies. It seems like the greatest testing site for foul conditions are quite close by, and designs can be shaken down close to home. Is there a certain place that they took new designs to see how they ran? To a certain degree, yes, but exactly where you went depended on where the ship had been built and what you were testing for. So there were certain measured miles where things like speed were tested, but exactly where the ship was run for a measured mile could depend partly on what kind of ship it was, partly on who had built it, because certain manufacturers had their own preferred testings areas, what time period the ship's been built in, because that shifts back and forth during the time period when you have things like builders' trials. So, in the 1870s, certain manufacturers will be testing in the southern part of the North Sea. In the 1900s, some manufacturers will be testing in the English Channel, and in the 1930s, some manufacturers will be testing out in the northern parts of the North Sea, and all various combinations thereof. And then you have the Royal Navy's acceptance trials and seaworthiness tests and inclination tests, all of which are going to be taking place in different environments. And then, of course, you also have the shakedown cruise, and obviously all of this might be obviated by wartime restrictions, but a shakedown cruise would be all over the place. So shakedown cruises would be testing for long-range endurance, so you'd be going across an ocean. They'd also test for multiple different environments. So a typical shakedown cruise might take you in the English Channel, might take you in the North Sea, which can be pretty vicious in and of itself, into the North Atlantic, down into the Caribbean, into the Mediterranean maybe. So you're testing all sorts of parameters: hot, cold, rough seas, calm seas, all sorts of weird wind conditions and wave formations. So about the only times you can probably pin down specific places they took new designs to see how they ran would be the various measured miles for speed testing. Other than that, it was just kind of a little bit all over the place. Andrea Marioni asks, what was more impactful for the United States Navy? The loss of Lexington, the loss of Yorktown, the loss of Wasp, or the loss of Hornet? I think it depends exactly on what you mean by impactful. In terms of spectacularness and potentially morale affecting, Wasp would probably be the most impactful, followed by Lexington. Yorktown and Hornet, whilst they were lost, they didn't go down in a particularly spectacular style. Indeed, Hornet almost refused to sink at all. Now, when you look at perhaps the wider strategic implications of the losses, then it changes a bit, because Yorktown, yeah, her loss is not brilliant, but you still have Enterprise and Hornet out at sea, and you have Saratoga coming up to be online, so you still have 3 fleet carriers, and more critically, the Japanese don't have many left at all. So the loss of Yorktown as a strategic impact to the US Navy in the aftermath of Midway is, I mean, it's not welcome, but it's not as bad as some of the others. The loss of Hornet is probably up there. Wasp is a bit of an odd one because the Japanese still have a number of operational carriers, but even if with the loss of Wasp herself, you've still got Enterprise and Saratoga out there on the front lines. Hornet at the time is in the vicinity as well, so it's not too bad from a strategic point of view, even though it is very, very spectacular. Hornet, as I say, is quite bad because that leaves the US Navy with basically 2 somewhat beat-up carriers left, although the Japanese Navy is almost in the same situation. But I think in terms of overall strategic impact, Lexington is probably actually the most impactful, at least to me. It's very tough for me to choose between the loss of Hornet and the loss of Lexington, but despite the fact it's the first big carrier to be lost, I would actually go for Lexington because of where it puts the US Navy in the immediate aftermath of the situation. Because remember, Yorktown is damaged, so she's not going to be doing much of anything in the immediate term. Lexington is flat out gone, and it's one of their 2 biggest carriers, which leaves you with Enterprise and Hornet, who have obviously been off doing the Doolittle raid, and Saratoga. Now, that's manifestly a better situation than the US Navy's in when Hornet has been lost, but comparative to what the Japanese have, it's a lot worse situation because you have 2 carriers available immediately on the front line. Yeah, you've got, I mean, Wasp is still over in the Atlantic. You can theoretically bring Saratoga up onto the front lines at some point if you absolutely need to, once it's been fixed up a bit. But although you have these potentials, you're effectively facing the Kido Butai with immediately to hand 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, and the Japanese still have the entire fleet, obviously, that they would historically put to sea at Midway, plus Suikaku, even if the Americans don't know that Suikaku won't be showing up because of Japanese intransigence with moving air groups around. So the actual balance of power in terms of number of carrier hulls and who outnumbers who is actually significantly worse for the US Navy after Coral Sea than it is strictly after the loss of Hornet, because after Hornet the US Navy might be down to 1 or 2 carriers in theatre, but so are the Japanese, which is very definitely not the case after Coral Sea. Christopher Villenfort asks, quick question about a bit of the hull. On destroyers in World War II, many times you see they had a piece of hull sticking out in front of the superfiring front turret and aft from the superfiring aft turrets. What is the purpose of it and what is it called? Well, you can see one here for Bliskovica, obviously mounted below the superfiring aft mount. They're blast deflectors, basically, because the guns are spaced quite close to each other, and unlike cruiser or battleship guns, where you are in a fully armoured turret, which obviously will deflect a good majority of the blast effect, if the ship is firing at a target, in this case directly aft of it, most destroyers have open-backed gun mounts. Okay, a few have fully enclosed ones, but most of them are open-backed gun mounts, which is especially the case with Bliskovica. And, well, if you're in the lower gun mounting and the upper gun mounting fires at the kind of position that's in at the moment in this picture, you are going to have some pretty nasty blast effects, and that's if it fires once. And obviously destroyers tend to fire quite a bit more often than just the once. So the idea of these projections is to deflect the blast of the guns up and away from the lower mounting crew for safety purposes. Also, as I'm reliably informed by some old destroyer crews, they also make rather nice weather shelters for the lower turret mount or the lower gun mount crew when the weather's particularly nasty, as long as the wind isn't sleeting in from a particularly extreme angle. Then one thing they aren't is shot deflectors. They're not there to stop the superfiring turret firing down into the lower turret. For one thing, the vast majority of destroyer mounts wouldn't be able to depress that low anyway, and for two, even if they could, that amount of steel isn't going to stop a 4 or 4.7 inch shell at that close range. If anything, it'll just become additional shrapnel, which is not exactly helpful. So yeah, they're pretty much almost entirely for blast deflection purposes, because you've got to remember, whilst to us a destroyer's armament, whether it be 4 or 4.7 inch or even 5 inch, might seem relatively small, and it is in naval terms, you're still talking about guns that are in the same ballpark as main battle tank guns of the modern era, or something like Jagdtiger guns, the gun of a Jagdtiger in the World War II era. And in Bliskovich's case, there are 2 of them. So yeah, much as standing directly in front of an Abrams or a Challenger 2 when it fires over your head is not advisable, nor indeed is crouching in front of a Jagdtiger, similarly, persisting in being directly in front of these guns is not a brilliant idea for your longevity. I Know My 3 Table asks, in the Age of Sail, did larger guns cease to use solid shot at close range to increase damage? It seems like solid shot from a dalgren would waste most of its energy exiting the opposite side of the ship at close range. Ships could use canister shot, grape shot, bar shot, star shot, chain shot, double shot, etc., which actually is 2 solid shot, at close range to cause different kinds of damage. But they wouldn't stop using solid shot entirely. And indeed, as mentioned, you could double or triple shot a gun, which would decrease the speed of a shot, which would then still punch through a ship at close range and obviously do 2 or 3 times as much damage because you'd have 2 or 3 cannonballs flying around. But both in the Age of Sail and then into the early Age of Iron, when you're talking about dalgren guns, for example, what they would also do is vary the charge weight. So you'd have a full charge, which you'd use for long-range shooting, which was also, by the time you got into the armoured era, sometimes also called a battering charge. But for close-range action against unarmoured vessels in the Age of Iron, or close-range action, period, in the classic Age of Sail, there would be reduced charges. And sometimes it would just be a full charge and a reduced charge, and sometimes there are a couple of different steps of reduced charge. But effectively, the idea was to you reduce the amount of gunpowder, therefore you reduce the velocity of the shot, therefore you don't end up with the cannonball just doing a through and through on the enemy ship for a few reasons. One, in a pell-mell battle, you might end up hitting a friendly ship on the other side, and for 2, the concept at the time, even though it wasn't actually strictly accurate, but the concept or idea was that you could, by reducing the charge and reducing the velocity, cause more of a smashing effect, which was one of the reasons why carronades were so popular. That's not actually quite how it works, but it's what they thought, and so it's what they provided for. Captain Landlocked asks, I recently read that in the Battle of Petrovaradin in 1716, during the Austro-Turkish War, Prince Eugene had 6 frigates on the Danube to support his troops, but I can't find anything about these ships. Size, names, where they came from, how they navigated a river as sailing vessels, etc. Can you help? In immediate terms, only to a limited degree, because, shockingly enough, the Austrian Navy, and later the Austro-Hungarian Navy, is not something there's a tremendous amount written about in English. I suspect, from what I've managed to find about this particular incident, and the fact that, yes, the frigates did exist, more modern sources tend to just leave it as an unreferenced statement that there were 6 frigates offering gunfire support. There are older books that I've managed to dig up from the 18th and 19th centuries that pretty much say the same thing, but they do reference books that they say, well, these books have more details about the battle and the campaign, and in some cases even say more details about the Danube flotilla itself. But the titles of the books they reference are all either in Northern Italian, German, or Hungarian, none of which are languages I read. And, given that they're referencing books from 150 to 200 years ago, there's a chance that maybe those books might not even still be available, or if they are, who knows where they are. So if you happen to be, Italian, Austrian, German, Hungarian, and you're listening to this and you happen to know where there's a book that talks about the Battle of Petrovaradin or the Austro-Turkish War generally in the early 1700s that might have a bit more detail about what these frigates were called, please do feel free to write in and tell me, because I'd be as interested as anybody else. But what I was able to find out is, one, they were part of a specific Danube flotilla or Danube fleet. So it wasn't just, ships that we've hauled in from the ocean, because apart from anything else, the where the Danube goes out into the ocean was not under Austrian control. And secondly, they were a specific type of riverine frigate. So this is an example from later on in the 1700s. This one's called the Teresa, but it apparently shares most of the design characteristics with the frigates that would have helped Prince Eugene, or Eugenie, I don't know, whatever. And as you can see, one of the key differences between this frigate and a sailing frigate out at sea is it has a full set of oars and also only has 2 masts, whereas seaborne frigates don't tend to have oars and they tend to have 3 masts. They're relatively small ships. They don't need to be as large as seagoing frigates because, of course, they don't need to take on quite the same amount of supplies, etc. In a similar way to how HMS St. Lawrence didn't need to have a raised aft section because it didn't need the accommodation and storage that a seagoing first rate did. And as a result, obviously, when there isn't wind, or if the wind is against them, they can use the oars to manoeuvre around instead on the river. And they also seem to be the descendants of earlier Austrian and Hungarian river flotillas that were more based around galleys. So they're kind of an evolution into frigate terms from galleys, rather than a straight descendant of oceanic ocean-going ships, at least as far as the Danube flotilla is concerned. Part of the problem is that the Danube fleet in the late 1600s and early 1700s seems to have waxed and waned in strength quite considerably, with some books noting that there were upwards of 14 what we might call rated ships, plus a ton of smaller ships. And then a couple of years later there were basically none. It was down to sort of 2 frigates because everything else had been sold for firewood, because, hey, the war was over and surely there was never going to be another fight in Central Europe. 10 years later, and shockingly enough, there was another fight in Central Europe, and they had to build everything up again, and then broke them up again, and yeah. Long-term thinking about naval presences on the Danube does not appear to have been an Austrian strong suit around that time period. Daniel Silverthorne asks, years back, a friend of mine who served aboard USS Hancock CV-19 during the Vietnam War told me about how while he walked through the hangar whilst the ship passed through a storm, he noticed significant twisting in 3 distinct sections along the length of the hangar, and obviously the rest of the ship, and said it had to have been flexing across 2 expansion joints. How would such an expansion joint, like he described, work in a ship like an Essex class without potentially causing structural weaknesses against other forces? Or was he wrong about the joints and was simply seeing the entire ship flexing as it would naturally? So I think he's partially correct. One of the things that is a less known difference between something like an Essex class or something with an armoured flight deck, like the Illustrious class, for example, is, and this doesn't apply to all armoured flight deck carriers, but it does when we're talking about the contemporaries for the Essexes, the Illustriouses and the Implacables. If your hangar and flight deck form part of your overall hull girder, you won't have expansion joints in the flight deck for the most part. You might have some small ones to allow for local heating and contraction, but you're not going to have a major expansion joints, and there is a difference, trust me. Whereas for the Essex class and other US carriers that were similarly constructed, open hangar designs effectively, the hull from the hangar deck level down is a structure, and everything on top of that, flight deck, hangar sides, etc., that's all superstructure. And therefore, it is not materially as strong as the hull. And therefore, you have to have some fairly major expansion joints in there, because otherwise, as the hull flexes, if the superstructure is rigid, then that superstructure can get crushed and ripped apart very easily. And so hence the expansion joints help to mitigate against that. Now, when your friend is noticing twisting in 3 distinct sections across the length of the hangar, yes, in part it's going to be flexing on the expansion joints, but it's also going to be because the hull is flexing, because that's why in large part, why those expansion joints are there in the first place. So what he's actually seeing is the hull beneath the hangar is flexing about, but as those forces are being transmitted to the hangar walls and the flight deck above his head, then the superstructure element, i.e. all of that's just described, is moving, but because of the expansion joints, different parts of it are moving in different directions. So let's say, for example, if the ship's moving through the sea and at a certain point there's a lot of torsion stress on the bow, if you were to take a laser measuring device or open lots of bulkhead doors so that you could see clean down the ship, in that initial stage you'd see the bow element of the hull twisting off to one side and everything else would be in place, but you'd see it happening in an arc. Whereas if you're in the hangar, what you'd see is the forward part of the hangar appears to be twisting, and the amidships and aft part of the hangar would appear to be stationary, because the expansion joint is giving it a pivot point rather than a continual arc of twisting, which is what you'd see further down in the hull. Obviously, as that wave then rolls on further down the hull and different parts of the hull are flexing, everything is going to start moving relative to each other. So if you've got, let's say, a wave that's causing a lot of hogging amidship, so the amidship section is being lifted up, and let's also say there's a lot of wind and current, and sort of the wave is moving maybe diagonally, so it's also causing the amidship section of the hull to maybe twist, let's say, to starboard. Then if you are in that section of the hangar deck, obviously your perspective is relatively static, but what you would see is, or perceive, is that you'd think that the forward part of the hangar has shifted to port, and then when you look round, the aft part of the hangar has also shifted to port, so it looks like everything's moving independently of each other, because of course the forward part and aft part of the ship have different rigidities and different amounts of strength, so they're going to move at different rates. And if you're in the aft part of the hangar, you're going to see, again, your forward and the midship sections moving slightly differently. So, yeah, he's seeing the entire ship flex as it would naturally, but it's being specifically exaggerated at certain locations because of the expansion joints in the hangar and flight deck. Matt Kidd asks, how good were early 20th century naval designers at estimating the speed of a design from the blueprints and models? Was there ever a big difference in expected and actual speed in the Dreadnought to World War II era? Generally, they were pretty good. Once Froude had invented his tank and run the numbers, created his various formulas, and model testing had begun, it was pretty spot on when it came to estimating what speed you could achieve, what kind of power you'd need to achieve it, and so on and so forth. And a lot of times ships would actually just about slightly exceed their design speed. Sometimes they'd come up just a fraction short as well. That wasn't unknown, but usually you'd find that unless someone had put in a lot of exceptional work, if you had designed a ship for, let's say, 25 knots, you'd usually see a trial speed of 24.5 to 25.5 knots. So they were pretty good at it. There were some notable exceptions. The Queen Elizabeth class, for instance, would never quite hit their 25 knot design top speed, except for maybe a couple of instances with the refits in the Second World War, the modernizations. And there would be a few cases where ships would significantly exceed their design speed. For example, design a ship for 26 knots, it might be able to go 28. But when that happens, you do have to be very careful if you get an excessive increase over their design speeds, because the design speed has a lot of factors taken into account, not just power plant output and hull form, but will also account for things like the overall performance of a particular engine set. So if you, and boiler set. So if you're, say, designing a ship and you say, right, well, we need arbitrary numbers here, 120,000 shaft horsepower to get up to 26 knots, and therefore each of our boilers can output 20,000 horsepower, therefore we need 6 boilers. Okay, so that's fine, whatever. I mean, not exactly to how you rate boiler output, but never mind, you get the idea. Now, if, like you have with a number of German battle cruisers, etc., in the run-up to World War I, somebody then goes, aha, yeah, well, that's the normal power output. But if we buy in this specialist coal and we get these elite stokers and we run the ship over a specific part of the ocean that's particularly good for helping large ships move at high speed, then the power output of the boilers goes way up. And let's say each boiler's putting out 30,000 shaft horsepower, 30,000 horsepower. So now with your 6 boilers, you've now got 180,000 horsepower. I mean, for one thing, you probably just destroy the ship, but it's a arbitrary example. You get the idea. Then, shockingly enough, the ship's going to move a lot faster than your design speed. But practically speaking, day to day, you don't have elite stokers. You won't be fighting over the same 2 square miles of ocean, and you will have more regular coal, and thus your actual speed is going to be significantly lower. So you always do have to, basically, when you see a particularly good or particularly bad set of trial data, always read further into it to find out why that came about and how that affects the overall design speed. Because I get sick to death sometimes of people going, oh, yes, well, German battle cruisers could do 3-4 knots faster than their design speed, so they were faster than anything else in the ocean. So, yes, in theory, if absolutely everything is in perfect condition, but you could say that about practically any ship. The fact is, in day-to-day combat in World War I, that wasn't the case, so it really doesn't actually matter. And it's like, in theory, rockets existed in World War II. In theory, I'm sure you could have pushed an hour class well north of 40 knots if you'd captured a bunch of V2s and strapped them to the quarterdeck. Might have worked. Completely irrelevant for any actual honest comparison, though. Lemongello asks, would the Japanese Navy have benefited from a Conti de Cavour style refit that deleted the central turrets of the Fuso class and extended the bow? Could they have reached a fast enough speed to provide fast carrier escorts whilst maintaining a similar armament to the Congos? Yes, in part, but part of an Italian-style modernisation I don't think would have done them as much good. So, effectively, what we're talking about is removing the 2 centre turrets and replacing it with machinery plus extending the ship. But when you look at the Conti de Cavour class, for example, in their original format, they've got about a 6-to-1, maybe just under 6-to-1 length to beam ratio, whereas the Fusos already have a 7-to-1 length to beam ratio. So it's a crude measure without going into the hull form and so forth, but the Fusos, just by length to beam, is actually already set up better for high speed. And you've actually got 2 additional, 1.5, 2 knots additional speed as a baseline to start with, because the Italian battleships are 21.5 knots, Fuso's 23 knots before refit. By contrast, the Congos have a 7.6-to-1 length to beam ratio, so they are a little bit more suited for speed than the Fusos, but both Fusos and Congos are suited for speed considerably more than the Cavours or the Dorias. So basically, yes, if you extended the Fuso lengthwise, you would get it slightly better tuned for speed, but the overall effect of that extension is going to be somewhat less than the effect of the extension on the Italian ships. But with that said, if you did strip out the amidships magazines and turrets and replace it all with machinery, especially sort of modern 1930s machinery, then yeah, I'm pretty confident you could get the Fusos up to 28 knots, possibly even faster, because, as I said, with the theoretically inferior length-to-beam ratio, even after bow extensions, the Italians managed to get their ships up to 26, 27 knots, depending on the favourability of the winds. So, as I said before, if you're starting with a 2-knot advantage anyway, getting the Fusos up to 28, maybe even 29 knots, especially given how much space you've got to play with, is, yeah, entirely possible. I mean, in her refit condition, which retained the turrets, the Fusos were already pushing 24, just over 24 knots anyway. Now, of course, that does raise a rather interesting possibility, because if you are just removing turrets, you're not affecting the ship's armour, and therefore the Fusos, obviously, you effectively get a slightly odd Congo equivalent, except with considerably better belt armour, which would be an interesting thing to take into the Guadalcanal campaign, and certainly far more useful than the Fusos were originally. And yes, they could well have then run carrier escort duties as well. To be honest, I suspect that you probably could get away with enough power to kick it up at least to 27, 28 knots just by removing one of the turrets and magazines, which would then leave the Japanese with a rather interesting choice of, do they go for broke and go for sort of 29 plus knots by removing both the midships turrets and having Congo equivalent firepower on better armour, or do they go for original flavour Congo speed with 10 guns and better armour, which would still, with cargo around, be a perfectly adequate carrier escort. And of course, you've also got to factor in that with no major blast effects amidships to consider, and therefore a lot more deck space to consider, the Fusos could, in a theoretical high-speed refit form, could quite probably mount a lot more anti-aircraft firepower. I mean, the other thing is, if you're going to go full modernisation, because the Fusos, as modernised, retain most of their casement guns and only had a few twin 5-inch. Again, in theory, if you refitted the Fusos full modernisation style, you'd probably get rid of the casement weapons and put entirely dual-purpose turrets on the main deck. Plus, I suppose you'd have a lot of 25mm for what that's worth, but it would make them somewhat more formidable as anti-aircraft vessels as well. And it also, I suppose, it depends when you're doing this, because you can always harbour thoughts of maybe having the twin 100mm as per the Akazukis instead, albeit that would basically require the ships to have been taken in 1939 and be coming out of modernisation in 1941, 1942, and there being enough of those dual 100mm around. But, you know, while we're theory crafting... Telemonian Dan asks, during World War II, a lot of older US destroyers were converted to fast troop carriers. Did the Japanese Navy, with its Tokyo Express runs, also modify their older destroyers to carry troops, or was it more a case of cram as many soldiers as possible into whatever destroyer you have to hand? And do you think the Japanese Navy would have been better served modifying older ships or purpose-building fast armed troop-carrying ships for their island conquests? The Japanese did rebuild or modify some of their older destroyers to serve as troop transports. They allowed them to carry small landing craft and more troops, etc. But it was by far a smaller program as compared to the US program. Maybe a dozen or so, give or take a few, Japanese destroyers were converted in this manner. And also, unlike the US program, it wasn't an extensive full rebuild. So if you look at the Wicks or Clemson class, for example, that were converted into APDs, they are basically stripped of everything armament-wise that they used to have and completely re-equipped, rearmed, and their profile often changes as well because they add bits to the superstructure. Whereas, whilst you can recognise profile differences between converted Japanese destroyers in their original forms, the changes are not quite as severe. It's more a case of we're removing things, usually aft guns and torpedo launchers, to spare weight and space for troops. So it's not the kind of full rebuild that a Wicks or Clemson would receive. It's not done explicitly in relation to the Tokyo Express. A couple of the conversions are actually done immediately pre-war, or just after the war begins, depending on exactly when you classify it, the refit as being. Do you count it as when they started doing it or when the ship came back into service? And a few more occurred during the war, but it was more of a case of just generally, converting on an as-needed basis and when the shipyards and budget allowed, rather than specifically for the Guadalcanal campaign. For that particular campaign, the majority of destroyers used for supply runs, whether that be taking troops to or from or taking supplies to or from, usually worked on the basis of they were fully active fleet destroyers, and they would either land their reload torpedoes, because they're the more modern destroyers, they'd land their reload torpedoes to save weight, or possibly in one or two cases might have landed all of their torpedoes, although that they almost always keep at least one salvo in the launchers, and then it would just be a case of cram everybody or everything, till it is applicable, aboard. Chief Eyeroll asks, what do you consider Admiral George Anson's most important accomplishment to be, and which one was ranked highest by him personally, profitable or not? It's a difficult one to quantify because a lot of his achievements are spread out. Granted, he did win a major battle and did a few other notable sort of point things, but if you wanted to assess his impact as his most important accomplishments, overall, it's probably what he accomplished at the Admiralty. Now, granted, he wasn't able to completely root out corruption and all sorts of other unsavoury things, but he did clear the decks to a fair degree, which helped set up the Royal Navy for success because it became a more efficient service. He also helped revise its tactics. So prior to Anson being in a high rank in the Admiralty, exactly how you fought wars with continental European powers was a little bit up in the air, changed almost war by war, and there are a lot of wars. Anson kind of helped oversee the transition from that to a more organised, we're going to defend our own coast, but also closely blockade the enemy's coast to cut them off from the ability to trade and the ability to operate their navy easily. And then once we've got them locked down and pinned down, also then go after their colonies and eat them up one by one, because that policy actually in many ways contributed to the later strength of the British Empire, because it meant that in every war where Britain was even partly successful, they'd usually taken a bunch of enemy colonies, which meant that you could either trade those colonies back to Spain, France, or whoever in exchange for maybe a British colony or two that had fallen, or you could trade them back in exchange for more favourable concessions at the peace negotiations, or if you captured one that was very particularly wealthy and useful, you could just not give it back. And all of those obviously helped to strengthen the British Empire in the longer term environment. But though all those accomplishments when he is in office, they're spread out over years, if not decades. So whether you count his entire time in high rank as a single accomplishment, or whether you try and break it up into individual ones, does make it a bit more difficult. Whereas something that's slightly easier to pin down, which, if you can't count his entire period in high office, would be my choice, would be his round-the-world voyage, which not a lot of people are aware of, but he starts out with 6 ships and ends up coming back with about half of a crew of 1, his flagship HMS Centurion, although it does also come back having captured a Spanish Manila galleon and therefore having absolutely fantastic amounts of money. But it highlighted a few things. because circumnavigations of the world up until that point had largely been limited to one-off entrepreneurs like Magellan or Drake, not organised naval attempts. And, well, 1 out of 6 survival rate for ships and a much less than 1 out of 6 survival rate for crews wasn't exactly a fantastic glowing recommendation of the durability of long-range naval patrols. So, although things didn't change immediately, it did mean that going forward there was quite a considerable drive lit to try and find out solutions to these problems. So solutions to navigation, solutions to getting rid of scurvy, which was the main cause of losses of men during the voyage, and so on and so forth. Whereas before, if you had an individual entrepreneur going out on a round-the-world voyage or an attempt at the round-the-world voyage, and even certain long-term naval missions, it was kind of just accepted that you'd lose a percentage of your crew to disease. The scale of the casualties involved in Anson's round-the-world voyage were enough, as I said, to lay the groundwork for actually attempting to solve these issues rather than just live with them. And given that, how many lives were saved by the eventual efforts that discovered how to get rid of scurvy, and the whole longitude, latitude, navigational issues which were solved by inventing proper timekeeping clocks, etc. All of that is in the long run probably the single most impactful thing he did, even though it wasn't in and of itself solving anything. It was just pointing out that there was an issue that needed to be solved. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Just a quick note, some of you may have noticed a slight increase in the overall number of Fun Fridays that you've been seeing this month. There is, at least at the time of you listening to this, one more to come. And that's simply for the reason that I have a few more things to say in February. And also it's a short month, so, get the video numbers up a little bit. The Fun Fridays aren't going to become a weekly thing. 3 videos a week I think is more than enough for my regular time slot schedule. And I'm already in the process of trying to produce some videos for April while I'm away in the States. So keep an eye on that later on. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much for listening. This is being recorded at the time that we're still subject to the latest storm to hit the UK, and nothing's fallen over here yet. Did have to go out earlier in the middle of the weather to patch up my granddad's windows because one of his neighbours' roofs unkindly shed a bunch of tiles through his windows, so that was fun. But other than that, all good here. Hope it's all good with you, and see you again in another video.